that changed in an instant. One moment, everything was normal: families, jobs, routines. The next, everything fell apart. The dead rose from their graves, the world went dark, and chaos spread across the land. Dylan, Caitlin, and her mother, Dawn, had managed to survive the initial chaos, escaping into the wilderness, hoping the isolation would keep them safe. But even out here in the deep woods, nothing was ever really safe anymore. It was a cold, moonless night when they decided to leave their cabin in search of supplies. Their food was running low, and they had no choice. Caitlin held a map in her shaking hands, scanning the distance. Behind her, Dawn checked their weapons, her face grim. Dylan, ever the protector, kept glancing around, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. "I don't like this," Caitlin murmured, her voice tight with fear. "You're not the only one," Dylan replied, his voice strained. "Stay alert." They had to make it to the town. They hadn't been there in weeks, and with the townspeople either gone or turned, it was the only place left to scavenge. Dawn had insisted on coming along, even though Caitlin didn't fully understand why. Her mother hadn't been the same since her father's death. Caitlin couldn't help but notice how distant she had become, as though something had broken in her that couldn't be repaired. They were halfway to town when they first heard it. A growl, distant but unmistakable. It was low at first, barely audible, but then it grew louder, like thunder rumbling in the distance. Dylan stopped dead in his tracks. "We're not alone," he whispered. Before Caitlin could react, shadows moved around them, figures stumbling through the trees, their limbs jerking unnaturally, their eyes blank and wild. Zombies. Creatures with hollow eyes, driven only by hunger. They were close to close. "Run!" Dylan shouted, grabbing Caitlin's hand. He didn't hesitate, pulling her away into the trees with Dawn close behind. They ran as fast as they could, the sound of growls and snapping branches behind them. They didn't dare look back. The creatures were gaining. They could hear their heavy footsteps, smell the rot in the air, feel the wind of their pursuit. A scream rang out Dylan's. Caitlin froze in horror. She twisted, trying to find him, but before she could do anything, the ground beneath her feet gave way. Dylan had been pulled down by one of the creatures, its fingers grasping at his leg, dragging him into the underbrush. His body twisted violently as more figures closed in around him. "Dylan!" Caitlin cried out. No, but it was too late. She could only watch as the creatures overtook him, tearing at his flesh, devouring him before her very eyes. "No," she sobbed, her body trembling. "Caitlin, we have to go." Dawn's voice cut through the panic, her hand grabbing her daughter's arm and pulling her away. But Caitlin couldn't move. She couldn't look away from the horror unfolding behind her. "Mom," she shouted, desperate. "Dylan." But Dawn remained calm, her face eerily unreadable. "We can't help him. We need to move." Forcing herself to turn away, Caitlin's heart felt like it was being ripped from her chest. She ran with her mother, stumbling through the trees, barely able to focus on anything but the image of Dylan, her husband, lying lifeless in the dirt. They ran for what felt like hours, the sound of the undead still closing in on them. Caitlin was breathless, dizzy, her mind a blur of fear and disbelief. She could still hear Dylan's screams echoing in her ears as though they would never stop. They made it to a small clearing. The moon barely illuminated the dark, empty space. Dawn came to a sudden halt. "Mom!" Caitlin gasped, her breath ragged. But Dawn was already walking toward the trees at the edge of the clearing, her pace slow. "Deliberate, Mom!" Caitlin called, her heart pounding. Dawn didn't respond. She was staring out at something Caitlin couldn't see. Something asterisk their asterisk. Her mother's voice was low, almost serene. "He's not gone, Caitlin." The air around Caitlin grew cold. Her stomach churned. She realized with a sickening sense of dread that Dawn wasn't speaking of her husband's death in the past tense. She was speaking as if Dylan was still here. Asterisk somewhere asterisk. Caitlin turned, her eyes searching the shadows. And there, standing just beyond the clearing, was Dylan. But it wasn't him, not really. The man she had married was gone. What remained was a shell of him, his eyes vacant and wild, his body trembling with hunger. "No," Caitlin whispered. He didn't speak. Instead, he took a slow step forward. Another. Then, with a speed that made Caitlin's blood run cold, he lunged. Her heart stopped. Her breath caught in her throat. "Gone." Caitlin screamed, but her mother didn't move. She only stared as the creature that was once Dylan came closer. The last thing Caitlin heard before everything went dark was her mother's voice. Calm as ever. It's too late for him now, Caitlin.